Hello, once again, everybody. I'm Mike Westendorf, and welcome to this week's edition of Great Questions, Great Conversations. It's a podcast for St. Paul's and the Bridge in Muskego, Wisconsin, where we talk about Christian topics, but we jump into it in a number of different ways. And we never quite know where the conversation is going to wind up, but I promise you that the time that you spend with us is going to be well worth your time, and you will come away with something of benefit to you. I'm excited about this podcast because today we get to welcome on a prolific author, a wonderful mind, a storyteller, and I've had a chance to be able to work with him a little bit here on our last year's Awake and Alive. And so I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Mr. Pastor Mark Paustian. Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine, even better since all that building up that you just did. Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking, Mike.
Oh, thank you so much for jumping in and being a part of the part of
Of
this.
course. Of course.
For our audience's sake, maybe just tell them a little bit about yourself, what you do, and your love. I'd love to hear a little bit of your love of story too.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm a family guy first and foremost, married to Connie, and I have two daughters and two sons-in-law that I love to death. I've been a pastor for about 36 years, so my first call was to start a church from scratch in Rockford, Illinois.
Mm,
And I've been at Martin Luther College, our College of Ministry, since 2000. So that's been, pushing 25 years.
yeah,
Teach Old Testament Hebrew, teach intro to apologetics for our young pastors, introduction to preaching for them. My main thing is probably teaching interpersonal communication. Got a PhD in communication going on 7, 8 years ago now. And that is a huge fascination of mine. So it's quite an interesting blend of things that I teach, but I love it. I love what I do.
yeah. The interpersonal communication, we got to talking about some things that we wanted to do with Awaken Alive this year, and the concept around story. And you mentioned the interpersonal communication. I remember over COVID, you did for the synod, our church body, you did a series of videos helping people with just some of the basics of sharing your faith and outreach. And our group used that, and I thought that you did a very good job of keeping it very even. It was very thoughtful, empathetic. I just was at a chapel where I was leading, and we were kind of using the text in James, be slow to speak, quick to listen. I love that, and that's a lot of how you phrased it. But then we got talking about story, and so I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about some of the research that you've done and the importance of story, because let's face it, you don't have to be a Christian to believe this. You see secular authors writing about the power of story. Netflix has its own production company. Prime, Amazon's got its own production. Like, production companies are popping up all over the place, and it's story, story, story. Even Don Miller wrote a fascinating book called "Building Your Story Brand," and the whole idea of part of the reason why your messaging doesn't work is because you don't understand how story works. And so, where was your fascination with story? And then we'll jump into why it's so important for the Christian.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have kind of intuitively arrived at story. We just kind of knew in our bones that this is a powerful way to communicate. And, I wrote my book, Prepared to Answer and More Prepared to Answer, just kind of on instinct,
Hmm.
dealing with the questions people have. And how about if I just told a gospel story as the first response to that? I didn't really study narrative until, years later, but I've discovered that, well, of course, I was onto something. And we've been in a narrative turn in our culture for probably almost 3 decades now, where now you see story everywhere. Like, for example, instead of a mission statement, well, just tell the story of your organization. It's just such a more compelling way to communicate.
Can,
So,
can I, this is me being that guy,
no, be that guy. All
you
you
said something that was really interesting. You said that there was a narrative turn in our country about 3 decades ago. Uh, can you speak to that? I'm curious.
Sure, I can. I can kind of go down or go back to the foundations in a man named Walter Fisher, who was a gentleman Christian scholar, probably top two or maybe three communication scholars of our generation. He's that important.
Wow.
And anytime you hear, like, I don't know, the Obama narrative, whatever,
Hmm.
that's Walter Fisher. That really is Walter Fisher. And I think you heard me say at a Wiccan Alive conference that there are reasons to think that a 2-minute story wrapped around a truth or an image is the single most compelling communication form. And that really comes out of Walter Fisher. And so he was Christian. He was not postmodern. He would say that there are good and bad stories as far as how they correspond to the truth and whether they're carrying objective truth or not in a faithful way. He would say, look on the pages of scripture and you'll see stories competing all the way back to the garden, the story that the devil is telling Adam and Eve. It's
Mm.
really a narrative in a way. And so, not postmodern, he thinks that there are good and bad stories, true and false stories. Um, it goes like this, and stop me if I'm being too academic or
Bring it on.
whatever. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bring it on.
So he articulates something he calls the rational world paradigm, which is a view that says that the world meets us in a series of logical problems, and all of Western education is really geared toward meeting life on those terms, like with critical thinking skills and so on. And all that is good, all that is fair. But Walter Fisher is saying that there's something far more basic to us as human beings. He has this term, we are homo narrans, which is Latin for we are storytelling creatures. And he thinks that we are really hardwired for narrative, that story is the most like life in the way it meets us, in a sequence of events and so on. This happens, then this, right? And so what he proposed instead of the rational world paradigm, something more fundamental to communication is called narrative rationality. And he believes that, children don't need to be taught to reason in story, that they are enculturated in narrative from the earliest days of formation. And so what he's saying is that much more hardwired to think and reason in stories, and that what makes stories powerful is there's a couple of qualities that they need to have. And so he's famous for this expression, narrative fidelity and narrative coherence. And what that means is stories that ring true and stories that hang together. Stories that ring true and hang together, then those stories will carry inside of them what he calls, curiously enough, he calls it good reasons. So that the best of stories, we can let the story be the story. The best stories don't explain themselves, they just carry inside good reasons to persevere, good reasons to hope, good reasons to serve, good reasons to yeah, endure and persevere and love. And so I
That
see. Oh, go ahead,
if
Mike.
if I could jump, I just when people say something, it's like, ooh, that's the tweet moment. That's the moment. Like, hey, audience, I don't want you to miss this. You said the best stories don't explain themselves. They just carry you on. Is that how you said that?
Yes, you can let the story be the story. And if you do that, you really are taking your cues from scripture, aren't you? Think of how many of the biblical stories don't take great pains to hit us over the head, with
Yeah.
some kind of lesson or meaning, but they really, in a very powerful way, leave work for us to do in completing the meaning. The fancy academic word for that is myoitic. The parables of Jesus are myoitic in that they leave work for the listener to do in closing the loop and getting at what they're communicating. But
So
Jesus had a
good.
lot of trust for his hearers in that way that he could let the story be the story.
That's amazing. Just to think about that. As a songwriter, for a long time, I would write a song and then I wouldn't trust people to get it. So I'd explain the
Hmm.
song, and which made my concerts, I'd sing fewer songs and I would talk more. And some people love that because that's the way that they were wired to like, I want every ounce of this. But other people are like, shut up and sing the song. And so I've learned that as I've gotten older, that idea that if you leave work for the audience to do, they take ownership of it. And there's always a bit of a risk that they can take it and move it in a different direction. But you just said it. Jesus did this all the time, leaving work for the audience to do. I mean, there's only a handful of the parables where the disciples were like, I don't get it. Would you please tell us what this was about? But there's only a couple that he actually
Right.
spends time really digging into it. The rest of it is for all of these centuries later, we're finding meaning. Even the guys who are around our table, our ministry team, you know some of them. They're closer to retirement age, and in their 60s, they're going, I never saw this before. And some 23-year-old kid was the one who brought up the point. And there is that's amazing.
Right. It doesn't have to be easy. We want the listener's effort to be rewarded as we maybe do take a bit of a risk that they will get there, but it doesn't have to be easy. We can trust people to put this together. There's a book that goes through contemporary communication theories, right? And so there's a chapter about Fisher's narrative paradigm, by a writer named M. Griffin, also a gentleman Christian scholar. The best communication researchers are all Christian, which you could think about that.
Mm,
But so this chapter trying to explain Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm just can't think of a better way to illustrate it than with the Book of Ruth. And so the Book
mm,
of Ruth has narrative coherence. The story hangs together right around a single moment where Naomi says about Boaz, that man's our redeemer. There's such a profound coherence to that book. But it also rings true. These characters are realistic and they're not acting in ways that jars or surprises. Well, nobody would ever talk that way.
mm.
And so what better way to illustrate than to say this is the genius of the biblical stories. They have that ringing true. They have that way of hanging together, and then they carry inside um, good reasons. Yeah, reasons to trust, persevere, hope, and so on. So it's quite a beautiful thing, really.
I remember years ago, we both know Luke Thompson. I'm sure
Sure.
you probably know him better than I do, but um, we had Luke very early on. I remember one of the first talks that he did in one of the college ministries I was working in. He was um, comparing and contrasting a little bit the dystopian narrative versus the biblical narrative, the worldview that begins with the problem of good and evil, that deals with it, versus the dystopian worldview that tends to not talk about the origin story. It just simply puts you into the survival of the fittest, and that's kind of the origin. And then all of the rest of the story happens to be primarily about drama and survival. Do you care to contrast that a little bit? And the reason I'm asking for this is because we have been what for probably 20 years now been living in a place where dystopian story and narrative has been the typical way of pop culture, um, and it's had an. I mean, I get that the iPhones and cell phones and that technology is kind of upended relational communication to to a large degree. Like we're struggling with loneliness in part because of our cell phone and quote unquote always connected space. But I also have wondered quite a bit about that rise of the literature in the dystopian literature versus the worldview that something like the Lord of the Rings came out of, that dealt with good and evil in a profound way that I hate to say it. You can even watch some of the violent movies that are on. I was watching one called Reacher. Some of our people may know that, but it's pretty violent. But there's a satisfaction because the bad guys in the end get what's coming to them. There's a justice, and the good guys win. You know, um, I'm not sure where I'm trying to take this, but I would love to hear just if you have an opinion on that rise of the dystopian narrative, and if you see anything there versus the Christian worldview narrative.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm very deep on that question. Like, I think it's important to recognize that we are being operated upon by culture's best love stories. And I think there's a passivity in us. We just think we're being entertained,
Mm,
but something is being smuggled in. Typically in, especially when you catch on to stories that are really taking hold and getting some traction in culture. But I don't really maybe have more to say about that. I just think it's important to recognize what's happening. I think, for example, science is telling a story. We think science is persuasive because of whatever the rigor of the research and findings. I think science is persuasive because it too is a
yes.
story about where we come from, a story about what's wrong with things, a story about what we can rightly hope for. It's just a very, very different story than the greatest story, which is a biblical one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think you're asking an important question.
Hmm.
My first moments in my PhD program, a professor said, "You want to change this culture?" He said, "Entertain it." And at the time, that
Whoa.
that really bothered me. I thought, no, I didn't want to think that was true. I was thinking from a Lutheran perspective
Yeah.
about you want the scriptures to do that and so on. But what he was saying is true as far as it goes. You want to change a culture, entertain it, because it's the power of narrative transportation, which is story takes us someplace, and it's the power of maybe you've thought about this too. A parasocial relationship is the people in mediated stories just feel so real to us. They feel like people in our lives, people that we know, and the power of media is an identification. It's when there's a character that we like.
Mm.
Let's say the hero of some dystopian story. We like
Yeah.
that character very much, and that there's an incredibly powerful influence that comes. But all the time, we think we're being entertained. We don't know that we're being acted upon. And so it's an important question that you're asking, I would say.
That's yeah. You're not just being entertained, you're being acted upon.
Hmm.
You know, I'm just going to say this to our audience real quick. I think I don't want to tell you what to think, but that's an important just pause. Like you could push pause on this thing right now and just take a couple minutes in your car, um, from your housework, if you're doing that, from your studies, if you're listening in, just take a moment to think about that. You're not just being entertained, you're being acted upon, and it's transporting you and me someplace. I would just love for you to just sit with that thought for a little bit and think about the spaces. To be honest, Mark, I'm going to be going back home. This is my only night that I really get a chance to be at home and have dinner with my wife. But we were talking about, do we watch season 2 of Reacher, or do we go back to season 2 of The Chosen? I, I think you just answered that one for us.
Don't get me started on The Chosen, Mike. I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
there's something in this too, I think, in the narrative paradigm that really informs our witness in a way. And so that is to say that, let's say we're having an intense conversation about Christian apologetics, and I was throwing evidence and support at you of all kinds. And let's say there's a lot of heavy content in our conversation. Well, the narrative paradigm, one of the things it's saying is that really all communication actually is a narrative, even that one. It's saying that because all communication, we really are experiencing it as an episode. So even saying hello in the hallway to someone, that's a narrative because I'm experiencing it as this thing that happened to me. So one of the insights that comes from the narrative paradigm is that after I've maybe witnessed to somebody in that way, pretty intense, a lot of evidence, reasoning, and support, a lot of arguing going on, but that over time, as time passes, all of that content, or most of it's going to drain out of your memory. And what's going to be left, if this is an episode, fundamentally, what's going to be left is really how I made you feel. That's what's going to be left behind for years and years. I talked to this Christian, we were talking about this or that. What did that feel like? And that's
Yeah.
why, sometimes I'll ask students, like, think of your favorite teacher. What did she say to you? And students sit there blankly. I can't remember anything she said to me. And this was my favorite teacher, but boy, do I remember how I felt, around her and receiving her
Yeah.
teaching, her ministry, her communication. And so it's why I think story then becomes just an ideal way to witness, because it also has that sort of stickiness that stories have. Like we talked about episodes. So episodic memory is how we remember the this and that in a story. This happened, then this, then this. And it's just so much more powerful, so much more powerful than I think it's called eidetic memory, like remembering numbers or digits, right?
Dates. Yeah, 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 yeah.
It just goes to Walter Fisher saying, no, we are storytelling creatures. It goes to that hard wiring. And so we can expect that people, well, we want to avoid what I think of as the performative contradiction, which is I'm talking to you about the love of God, but you're not feeling it. Right? You don't feel especially
Ooh.
loved by God as I talk to you because I have to be more aware of the lasting power of how I'm treating you and the lasting impact of yeah,
That's
the warmth and the love that you got from me as we communicated. Because what's going to stick for 10 years, 20 years, first of all, is the story, and then it is that whole couching in, I'm repeating myself, but how I
hmm
made you feel.
yeah.
And
No,
all that
that's
attaches to Walter Fisher. He was saying this, decades ago, really.
yeah. Yeah, I'm talking about the love of God, but you're not feeling it.
Right.
Or I'm talking about the love of God and you're feeling it. How much more powerful, like you said, how sticky that is.
Hmm.
That's amazing. I'd like to pivot a bit, and thank you for this. We were talking off air before about how academic can we get on this, and I hope that was helpful for some of you. Again, that big thing, all communication we experience is an episode, but I just like that if you want to change the culture, entertain it, but then just remember that story takes us someplace. You're not being just entertained, you're being acted upon. That's powerful. But I want to shift now to some of the crux of what your talk was for the young adults at our retreat this year, because it was very powerful, and we've actually started doing it in our own small group because it was just such a neat way that you brought it about. The picture of use, we talk about these Bible stories like we like them, but we don't think about them as part of our witnessing thing. We may think about it as a Bible story, like you do for a Bible study, something that you do that's churchy, but you actually brought it out into the open to say, as Christians, this is one of the ways that we can let our light shine. And because story is so impactful, part of the thing that we can do is we can entertain our listener with the story that has a particular purpose. But you gave us some really good guidelines on how to kind of get there and how to do it. So if you could spend a little bit of time just helping our audience understand how the Bible stories that they've grown up and loved and know are powerful witnessing tools and how to do that.
Yeah, I had a group of teachers together in a conference in the last year, and just got them talking about stories along the lines of, "What's your favorite story? Like, what's your favorite?"
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of made a point that, do you know why it's your favorite? Because if you can't really express or articulate what it's doing to you and what it's doing for you, why that story, then maybe your understanding of what's going on with that biblical communication might be maybe more superficial than you want it to be. So I like to say, what's your favorite story? And now we're going to always ask, of course, what does it teach? And it's very, very important to mine these gospel stories, let's say, for the good and wholesome doctrine that they convey. What are they saying about Jesus? What are they saying about his character and the character of God? And so we're never going to stop asking, what does each story teach? But take your favorite story and really linger in the question, what does it do to you? What does it do for you? And try to really spend some time. It's sort of question that just can't be hurried and can't be rushed. Because what we're trying to do is get past what would maybe be only an intellectual response to the story, but get into something that's more holistic, more stories are just brilliant for bringing together both reason and feeling, because of the power of the imagination, I suppose it is. But to be able to get past merely an intellectual engagement with these stories, but to just get at the thing, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so when I refer to a group of teachers, we got them talking about their favorite stories, and we had a good half hour. And at one point, we just wanted to kind of say, do you realize what's happening now? And you have just been expressing your faith in the most beautiful ways. And maybe you didn't think of it in those terms as I am right now witnessing.
Right,
But
right.
you are. You're talking in such a beautiful, authentic, transparent way about Jesus and the things that he did and the things that he said that are to you so remarkable. And so that's kind of it's been a way to. It's not the only way to witness to Jesus. Of course, there's lots of ways, but it's a
Hmm.
way that can really expand your view of what that can sound like.
You had asked, and I love that. What does it teach you, and what does it do to you? What does it do for you? Another way that you had put it, I think, in the talk is how does it confront you? How does it comfort you? Could you unpack that a little bit? So maybe even give an example just for our listeners who are trying to grab that.
Sure. I mean, it's a way to get at, um, well, essential law and gospel, but maybe in slightly different terms. So you take a story like Jesus telling the story of the two men who go to church, right? And it's the Pharisee and the tax collector. And I like to start by just, well, where do you stand in this story? Like, which are you? Are you the tax collector, can barely lift up your eyes, and you got your fists at your chest? Are you the Pharisee that are really pretty self-satisfied in the moment and thanking God you're not like, well, like where do you stand in this story? And you quickly figure out, boy, I stand in both those places.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm one, then I'm the other, self-righteous, and then right back on my knees again. And then to ask a question like, okay, what does this do to you? And how does it confront you? It just is kind of compels a person to bring to mind that time when, we surprised even ourselves and there was a badness that we just didn't know we were capable of. And all of a sudden we're face to face with that. And so, but in that case, as I'm saying, I think that story confronts us with both sides of ourselves, both the Pharisee yeah, and the person on his knees that can hardly look toward the sky, right?
yeah,
In both those ways. And then how does it comfort me? Well, I mean, there's a lot of comfort in that story. It starts in the storyteller himself,
yeah.
who told what is, when you think about it, one of the most radical things that can ever have been said is that story. That the man who just can only say, Lord, have mercy, he goes home justified. He goes home declared righteous in the sight of God. It's just an incredibly radical story. How can Jesus say such a thing?
Hmm.
Well, he's going to, pay the price in his own body and soul to say such a thing. So really, I think just how does the story confront you? How does it comfort you? Really is a way to get at law and gospel, essentially.
Yeah. Which is yeah, which is a great way to think about that. I know for me when you said it, and even in our small group, those were the words that help people articulate more. What does it do for you? What does it do to you? A couple of people were like, what do you mean by that? And then confront and comfort. Oh, okay, I can get my head around that. Um, you you challenged our group, and a little bit of a song came out of that too by um, it reminds me of a story. Stop me if you've heard it. Could you talk a little bit about? I loved some of the example that you gave because this is again, if you know the Bible story, and for those of you who don't know the Bible story, this is just an invitation to read the narratives and to just sit with the beauty of the message of the gospel, the challenge of the law, but the utter comfort that we have, and then the empowerment to go and be the salt and light. I know some people are like, I don't talk a lot like Moses. Send somebody else. I'm thinking Strengths Finders. My wife has Intellection. I know a number of people that are some of my favorite people, and they are slow to speak because they've got the ideas that are bouncing around, and so sometimes they can miss the window or lack confidence to say, "No, I really do know something. I do have a story to tell," and that this was, I thought, a profound way to help all of us, no matter where we're at, um, love our Bible. And I can't wait to be put in a situation where, hey, that I got a story that I can share. Stop me if you've heard it. So could you take us through that?
Take us through.
You were getting your hair
Hmm.
cut. I think
Oh,
was that
okay.
one.
Okay. Well, yeah, for a couple of years I'd been using this approach with a Bible study at my little mission. And it would just we would just study the stories and just enjoy them, and then afterwards we would always just ask those questions like how does it confront you, and how does it comfort you, and how would you tell this story? And we would
Yeah.
practice it.
How
And we
would you
would
tell this
practice it.
story? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'd practice it. And I forget which stories I said in Awake and Alive, but one time we were role playing this story, or role playing an example where the woman was pretending to have led a wanton life, sexually impure and just really um, kind of beat up by her past in that way. Where she's pretending to be that kind of person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I was role playing the witness, and I just I wonder if you heard this story, and I told about a 2-minute version of the woman caught in adultery, and all the way through, and Jesus says, "Where are they that condemn you?" And and he said, "Neither do I condemn you." And when I offered that line, just role playing it, I mean, this woman just kind of fell apart, and I might have said that she's not role playing anymore. We had just kind of tapped into there's real power here. I mean, the stories not only are inspired by the Spirit, but there's just real something to learn about that form of witness. So that's probably the story I've used most often as a witness. It's just the woman caught in adultery. I've just kind of gravitated toward that story because the grace of God comes so suddenly and so without condition in that story. But so you asked about the haircuts. So I taught this method for a while without ever having actually done it. And you know,
That's the
and
typical problem of the church worker. We're not out there
yeah,
quite enough. So,
isn't that true? But I was getting my hair cut, and I had a book in my lap with the title, with Jesus in the title, which I like to do. It just creates conversation, right? And this young woman who was cutting my hair named Kayla, um, she said, "Oh, I'd never been to church. I'd never been to church once in my life." And she said, and then she started to tell me her story. And her story was that she was a little girl, like 7 years old, and her parents just fought all the time. And she told me a really hard story about this. And she said, "Yeah, one night I had to get between my parents. I'm 7 years old. I get between my parents. Just real ugliness in her parents' marriage." And she said, "Well, that night I'm lying in my bed, and she said Jesus came and sat in my bed, and he didn't say anything. You could just see the side of his face in the nightlight, and he just sat there till I fell asleep, right?" And now, to me, the way I've taught this or thought about it, the beauty of using story is instead of asking, "What do I say?" you simply ask yourself, "Well, what story can I tell?"
mm,
And there's a good example because in that example, what do I say about Jesus coming to this girl in her bed at night? What do you say about that?
right,
I mean, that's got a lot of theological implications to it. And so I might say, well, Jesus doesn't do that. I mean, sure you want to do that? You want to take that away from her?
right.
Never been to church, has one warm memory of Jesus. So
Yeah.
what do I say to that becomes really challenging. But if I just ask, well, what story can I tell? The story comes to mind. I said something, and I think I said to your audience at Awaken Alive, don't think I'm smooth at this. Don't assume it was awesome or anything like that. But I did tell the story. And I said to her, Jesus did come to a little girl in her bed. Did you know that? You've ever heard that story? Right?
Hmm.
And she says, no. And I said, do you want to hear it? And she says, yes. So I told the story about the little girl who was dead. And Jesus came and I told the whole story. The 2 minute version is,
Yeah.
she's not dead, she's sleeping. And they laughed and he kicks them out of the room and Jesus does. And he, and he bends down to her and says, Talitha cum, little girl, get up. And she did.
Hmm.
And so I don't forget to say it. All the times in my life I've asked someone, have you ever heard this story? They just never have heard the stories. They've just never heard it. And it just makes me think, isn't this a great way to be introduced to Jesus? Is the things he said and did, right?
Mm.
So anyway, I said something like, he said, little girl, get up, and she did. And she was alive. And I said, that's real. That's true. And I said, Jesus really does still come to people when they're dead inside because they don't know who God is. They don't know what to do with all this guilt and fear and so on. And he still comes to them in his word and he wakes us up. He
Mm.
wakes us up. And now we're alive to God. And so I don't know if it came out very well, Mike, to be honest. I'd never practiced that story before I used it, but what I can tell you is that the next time I'm getting my hair cut, she says to me, hey, remember that story you told me? Which is crazy. She heard this story one time and wasn't sure, I remember. And she said, well, I told my husband. So she hears a story one time, it's already hers, she owns it, and can actually tell it to someone else, even if she doesn't even know what it means yet.
Yeah.
So I told my husband, and I said, wow, what did he say? Because she had told me this much that her husband was kind of a scoffer and kind of made fun of religious people. And okay, what did he say? I'll never forget this. She said nothing. He just hugged me. And she said, and now he drives by your church building site just to see how it's going. Right?
Wow.
So, holy cow. And then the third time I'm getting my hair cut, it was just so beautiful. And the third time I'm getting my hair cut by this woman. Um, I forget exactly how this went, but she essentially asked me, like, what does it all mean? I
Mm.
forget what the question was, but I just preached on 2 Corinthians 5. God was reconciled the world to himself in
Yeah.
Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And so I kind of just replayed the essence of that sermon to her, which was really cool to think about it. So here she is on the basis of a story. Here she's asking me what it all means. And I always think when someone asks you, I mean, that's the home run.
Yeah.
It just gets fun at that point. It just gets
Yeah.
easy. So I told her the gist of that sermon, and again, things you never forget. She stopped cutting my hair, and our eyes met in the mirror, and she says to me, so there's no hoops to jump through.
Mm.
And you got it. You got it. There's no hoops to jump through. Like, boy, did she ever get the point.
Yeah.
So that was a second experience. One was talking in a Bible class role play, and this moment happens. It's so powerful. And that was the second experience that made me think, we are onto something here. We are definitely onto something. So I've said for years, don't ask yourself, what do I say, but ask, what story can I tell? But what I realized is that I've got a lot of practice at this, so I can kind of get away with it. But some people might be a little bit more daunted by that. And so the
Mm.
latest idea was, well, what if you had a playlist?
Mm.
What if, first of all, we start with your very favorite story and you've thought deeply into it, what that story means to you. I thought, let's start with that one. And let's actually think through, how does it confront you? How does it comfort you? And actually then think through, how would you tell it? What is the 2 minute version of that? And how would that actually sound? And then you can think about, well, what are all the questions that this story really is the answer to? And the playlist I
Say that line that part
okay.
that last part one more
Yeah.
time.
That was one of the powerful questions
Yeah.
too. It's the question of, okay, here's your favorite story. You've thought about it, how you would tell it. Now, who needs to hear this story? Or to what question is this story the answer? Or to what situation would I just love to inject this story into that situation? So, who needs to hear the story of the woman caught in adultery? Who needs to hear the story of Jesus raising that little girl to life? To what question is that story the answer? And I think then the idea is it doesn't all have to be kind of impromptu off the cuff, but if I've thought about 4 or 5 stories that really address a broad range of the questions people have, I think that really could turn my, just unleash my witnessing. And then the line you practice, the line I've learned to ask is, how do I make the transition into the story? Well, someone says something, shares a question or problem situation, I'm just simply going to say, you know what? That reminds me of a story. Tell me if you've heard it. And, and I've just never, Mike, had someone not want to hear the story. I've never had them say, oh, I heard that before. And so one way I've thought about this from a communication perspective is that we tell stories all the time as we get to meet people, as we are, the key term here is socially penetrating. So we're we're navigating that line of who do we share what with. That's called social penetration. But as we're doing this with each other, stories are just what we do. We tell each other 2 minute story. You hear the story how I met my wife.
Hmm.
You're going to hear the story of how I broke my arm in ninth grade. Crazy story. Just we're just gonna That's what's gonna happen as we get to know each other, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And even as a kind of a shy guy myself, and introverted, I just at some point figured this out, that I can keep these gospel stories sort of in the same box in my head from which I draw all my best conversation. And the same with the same feel, I guess, the same kind of naturalness. Hey, can I tell you how I met my wife? It was the coolest thing. Hey, can I tell you this story about this woman? She's caught in adultery and they drag her to Jesus and, put the question to him, what should we do with her? Right? That with the very same feel, the very same naturalness, with the very same sort of transparency.
yeah,
Um, to me, that's my favorite way to witness. And just putting that together in my head has really, as I said before, really kind of unleashed my witness in a way. And it's so much fun.
yeah. I
Right.
I like I like that you're saying it that way. It is so much fun. I've said before that I think a lot of people discount their witness, their
Hmm.
ability to tell a story. I think that a lot of them are saying, "Well, I'm not a professional Christian. I'm not a pastor. I'm not somebody who works in a church. Therefore, I can't do these things." That's why for me, I'm very strong on the whole idea of biblical literacy. Let's just help you read the Bible so that you understand with confidence that you can do it and what this is all about and how. And that's what I love the story piece is that yeah, what are your 3 or 4 stories? It becomes a playlist of the ones that you love. But if you actually sit down deeply and think about it, as you said, and that idea, to what situation or to what question is this story the answer? You mentioned the woman caught in adultery. So anybody who is feeling shame over a sin, particularly being caught in a sin, that this story would be the answer to what they need to hear, the gospel that they so desperately need to hear. And if you've ever been around it, and you just described beautifully of the story of Kayla, that if you've ever been around somebody who has gone from that are closed to eyes that are open, a person that is breathing in this gospel promise, like I think about that passage in Galatians, for the joy set before him, Christ endured. There is a joy being set in front of us with every person that we encounter. And every once in a while, God gives you the place to slow everything down. And if you and I can just be a little bit more self aware and a little bit more confident, the, the, the return on this investment is the joy set before you. You get a glimpse of what Jesus saw and Jesus sees when somebody passes from death to life. And that you get to be a small part of that and have a small glimpse of that. God's doing the work, but he lets you in on it. Oh, does the kingdom of God just explode? And it's like, I want more of that. Let's go. You know?
Absolutely. Absolutely true. And when I describe these groups I've been with that they just really grabbed hold of this idea and began to tell each other the stories they love the most and why. I just don't think witnessing is really any different than that. In other words, that we can find the joy of this kind of talk in the twos and threes of believers. And there isn't really any transition to make if I'm talking to someone who happens to be on the outside of Christ at that moment. It's the same thing. Here's a story I love. Here's a story that gets me through. Here's a story that holds me together. Here's a story I fell asleep thinking about last night. Here's a story my pastor told. I mean, it's just no different than enjoying this kind of talk among ourselves as believers.
Yeah. Mark, this has been so good. This has been so good. It's everything I was hoping that we would do.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Mike.
I'm looking forward to hearing what kind of feedback we get and what other questions come out of this. With your permission, I'd love to be able to revisit this down the line and talk a little bit more about some of the things that you are learning and that you have learned. And so I just want to say on behalf of everybody who's listening, thank you for your ministry. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep learning, keep growing, keep sharing. We are very grateful for you.
Thank you, Mike. Right back at you. I've loved this very much. Thank
Yeah,
you so much.
you're welcome. So that is our conversation. Great question. Great conversation with a doctor and pastor and teacher and just all around great guy, Mark Paustian, who has been helping us understand the importance of communication and the importance of story. I hope that this has been a helpful one for you. Again, great questions, great conversations is a podcast of St. Paul's in Muskego, St. Paul's in the Bridge in Muskego, Wisconsin. We talk about a number of different Christian topics in an authentic way, and I hope that this one has been a help for you. We'd love to hear any comments, any questions that you have. We'll leave a few links to some things for you in our information in the show notes as well, so you can connect with Mark and find out a little bit more about him and some of the books that he has written to be able to help you in sharing your faith and growing in your faith as well. That's what we've got. Until next time, I'm Mike Westendorf. You are listening to Great Questions, Great Conversations. We will talk to you again.